thank you also to Isai Ongar and to Wake Up for Your Rights for the invitation to speak today. It's really quite an honor. I'd also just like to offer my condolences to anyone in the crowd who's affected by the loss that Isai mentioned of a Kenyan member of the community here in Cedar Rapids. I do have one slight objection, and that is the ordering of the speakers. When you ask a lawyer to follow a poet and musicians, you're in for a little bit of trouble, because lawyers and musicians are people who can really capture the essence of the pain of oppression and injustice, and the tools of the law are very dry by comparison, but they are the only tools that I have, so I apologize in advance, but I will try to make use of them. I was invited today to speak about human rights in Africa, and I can only imagine, although I haven't spoken about it, but I can only imagine that this is a call on me to help to state the problems, perhaps as I have seen them, and not the solutions. Because one of the things that has impressed me very much about Wake Up for Your Rights, and is one of the primary reasons that I'm here today, after having met with Isai and Bibi and others, is this is an organization of Africans, looking for African solutions to your own problems. And I will speak somewhat out of turn here, but having spent a few years in southern Sudan, a little bit of time in Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, I saw way too many instances of Americans, Europeans, others coming in and steamrolling and stampeding over local priorities and trying to insert their own point of view and their own vision of what is the correct solution, and it pretty much never worked. And so that's a model I reject and that I refuse to follow, and so I hope you will forgive me if I confine my remarks to what I see as some of the violations happening, different kinds, different places, and leave the coming up with solutions to others. I will, of course, offer whatever modest assistance I can offer in that regard, but that is what I see my role as here today. And since I'm a lawyer, I'll start with the law. I'm sorry, I think there's probably people in here for whom this will be very elementary and a little bit of review, but I think it's important to open any discussion of violations of human rights in Africa by saying that the law, not the practice, the violations are still happening, the law has changed significantly over the last 50 to 60 years. The law did not used to be on the side of the oppressed peoples in the countries of Africa. Under colonialism, under apartheid, during the imperial era in Africa, the law was on the side of the oppressors. What they were doing was often okay under the laws or constitutions of their country. Apartheid, the most famous example, was deeply embedded in the entire legal structure of the country. And since that time, there have been radical changes on the international and the regional and the national level that have actually created a legal basis for people to use when trying to fight for their rights. On the international level, starting in the 1960s and continuing all the way through to today, we had the beginning of the treaty-based system of international human rights law. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We have the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racism, elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention Against Torture. They go on and on. I could name them and take up my entire 10 minutes. I won't do that. This is significant. This was a major departure from previous practice, where now countries, states, rights are being constrained. They're being told by the international community, who's sick to death, literally, of all of these human rights violations, that you can't do them anymore. Now, we all know, there's a huge gap between law and practice. But the fact the laws exist now is a major step forward. But it's not just international conventions, global, let's say, international treaties. Also regional. There's the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. This is an African document. And by the way, it's different in a lot of ways that reflect the African character from some of these other human rights instruments. And a lot of countries in Africa are covered by this. And it also, and I'll come back to this, creates mechanisms. It's an African Commission on Human and People's Rights, an African court now, after many years of struggle of human and people's rights. But it's not even just these regional agreements. Starting about, you can say 20, 25, 30 years ago, there's been a wave of what academics and practitioners call liberal constitutionalism. Not just in Africa, but all over the world, but also in Africa. Where, and again, South Africa is a fantastic model. The South African Constitution, the post-apartheid South African Constitution, is held up actually the world over as a paragon of modern constitutional design, and it contains wonderful sections on human rights, not just their guarantee, but their enforcement. Now, that's not to say that South Africa doesn't have problems. Every country has problems. Things are coming out now that are not as positive as they could be, but the Constitution is there, and it's not just South Africa. I'm using that as an example, but it's all across the continent. I played a modest role in helping the Southern Sudanese at the time put in an interim constitution after their conflict was over, and the comprehensive peace agreement had been put in place. And again, really excellent section on human rights that reflected the careful choices made by the Southern Sudanese drafters of that constitution. And so, are human rights violations occurring? Yes, all the time, every place, and we'll get to those in a second. But I think it's important to remember that there is a legal basis for fighting them now, and there are even mechanisms and institutions where you can go to fight for those rights. Unfortunately, I can't lean on that. Unfortunately, just changing the law does not change behavior. This is one of the main crises faced by any lawyer who works for social change, because it's not enough to change the law, you have to change behavior, and behavior, unfortunately, is not being changed. And I would, at this point, venture to say that discussing human rights in Africa is very difficult, because Africa is not just one entity, although many people might think it is. No one in this room, of course, but I am reminded of, this could be apocryphal, but supposedly someone was giving a speech somewhere in the American Midwest, and they got to the topic of Africa, and someone in the audience raised their hand and asked if that was a poor country. We all know better. And we all know that the human rights violations in different countries have a different character. There are human rights violations that come from dictatorship, brutal, oppressive dictatorship. There are people in this room who have experienced that themselves firsthand, fought against that themselves firsthand. And so I will try not to touch on Chad, but I can talk about Sudan, where I was for a little bit. Before the peace agreement and before the separation, you had a very brutal and oppressive regime in the north that was not at all concerned with the human rights of its people, but rather was concerned with power and domination and economic superiority. And it guaranteed that power, domination, and economic superiority by violating almost every imaginable right of people in the southern we see that model of dictatorial repression, unfortunately, being repeated over and over and over again. I would venture to say, it might generate some disagreement in the audience, that we are seeing that in Zimbabwe. There are very, very credible reports that, just to take one example, that in his bid to stay in power, Mr. Mugabe has deployed teams of supporters to rape women who are members of the opposition as a form of intimidation to break the political opposition there. And this is a story, and this is a pattern that we are not unfamiliar with in different countries in Africa. And it's a story that's very commonly told in the news, which unfortunately paints a negative picture of Africa for people who have never spent time there. But it's not the only pattern. There are also countries where the government, let's say, is trying and is somewhat forward-looking and wishes they could do more to guarantee the human rights of their citizens. I'm thinking here of Liberia, where I've done some work. And, you know, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and her administration, is it perfect? No. Is there corruption? Yes. Are there problems? Absolutely. No place is perfect. But I would argue that on the whole, they're trying. This becomes now a problem of resources. This becomes now a problem of knowledge, of awareness, of access. So in Liberia, they want to enforce the law. They want to give people access to the courts. They want to prevent rape, which is, I'm sorry to keep coming back to that, but it's a particular also problem in Liberia. But you can't pay the police officers. You can't give doctors effective training in how to properly document cases of sexual violence when women come into the hospital. You can't give judges the tools they need to appropriately adjudicate these cases without resources. And the entire budget of the entire government of Liberia is $230 million a year for the entire country. This might sound like a lot of money, but it's really not to run an entire country. So here we have a problem with resources.